Recently, Seth strolled down Central Street, where his company, where he had been an engineer for almost 15 years, had relocated to a new building. Despite the increased distance and traffic making the commute more challenging, the bright, beautiful building and pleasing cityscape made up for it. The city center, filled with parks, squares, and intellectual inhabitants, offered a lively atmosphere. Instead of rushing to his car after work, Seth began to unwind by walking the streets, enjoying the lively scenes with children holding balloons, eating ice cream, and lovely elderly couples making each day feel like a celebration. By the time he reached his car, the evening traffic had usually subsided. Home had become a more inviting place since Janet moved in, with the apartment now smelling of freshly baked goods, homemade meals, and feminine fragrances. Janet's warmth, kindness, and comfort softened Seth's heart, despite the hardships he had experienced. Not everyone could endure what had happened to Seth's family. He once believed he was no longer capable of strong feelings, but Janet proved him wrong by bringing quiet, calm joy to his life. Together, they enjoyed watching TV series, going on picnics with friends, and traveling to the sea during the velvet season. Still, Seth was not entirely free from heavy thoughts, especially since it wasn't known what had happened to Susie. Young parents with small children, especially girls of 4 to 5 years old, still attracted Seth's attention. One family in particular caught his eye, a young mother and father, dressed in a bright printed t-shirt and jean shorts, with 2 children, a listless, bored-looking 8-year-old boy and a curious 4-year-old girl. Seth noticed the parents appeared slightly weary of their young daughter's incessant questions, with the mother responding with one-word answers and the father sometimes irritably asking the child to be quiet. Seth thought to himself how these young parents didn't realize the joy of holding their little daughter's hand and engaging in conversation with her. Seth would now happily answer a million questions from a 4-year-old girl. As the saying goes, we often fail to appreciate what we have. Years ago, Seth thoroughly enjoyed fatherhood. His daughter Susie never irritated him as a young father, perhaps because he and his wife Janet had longed for a child. Seth and Janet met in college, studying related engineering specialties, attending many of the same lectures. Seth quickly noticed Janet, a beautiful, quiet student with large blue eyes. Being one of the few women in their faculty, Janet stood out with her light wavy hair, wide-open eyes, and refined features. However, Seth was drawn to her not only because of her beauty but also her sincerity. Unlike other girls, Janet didn't flirt or deceive. She was genuinely passionate about her studies, much like Seth. Any attempts at romance from other students were firmly rejected. When Seth was paired with Janet for a project, their successful teamwork led to friendship, which eventually blossomed into romance. Janet and Seth had much in common. They grew up in similar families, shared interests, and their life plans largely aligned. Both wanted to build a career, achieve something, find their place, and then start a family. After getting married and renting an apartment, Janet worked in a research laboratory, continuing her scientific work, while Seth chose an internship at the engineering department of a plant. Their initial salaries were modest, but as they climbed the career ladder, their incomes increased. Eventually, they were able to buy their apartment and renovate it. The couple lived harmoniously, with Seth finding Janet's company easy and pleasant. They understood each other intuitively, resolving disagreements through discussion and negotiation rather than arguments. Seth's mother once told him that with his pedantic and correct nature, no girl would tolerate him. She was proven wrong by Janet, who was as rational and conscientious as Seth. It seemed that they had found their perfect match. Seth was happy. His life was unfolding even better than he had dreamed. He had an interesting, high-paying job and a loving and understanding wife. 7 years into their marriage, Seth and Janet began discussing having children. They had prepared financially for their future heirs, and all the grandparents eagerly awaited a grandchild, promising to help with childcare. This meant Janet wouldn't have to sacrifice her career at the research institute. The couple decided to approach parenthood consciously, undergoing a full medical examination to minimize the risk of health issues in their child. It was then discovered that Janet had serious fertility problems. "Pregnancy is practically impossible," declared the famous doctor whom Janet had finally managed to see. "So, there's no chance at all?" Seth asked for clarification, having accompanied his wife to the clinic that day. "Well, you can try various treatment options," the doctor replied evasively, "but these methods are expensive and time-consuming with no guaranteed result." Congenital abnormalities occur, unfortunately. This news was a shock to the couple. Everything had been going to plan, and then suddenly this happened. After the doctor's disappointing verdict, both Seth and Janet realized how much they wanted to become parents. The treatment period began with visits to various doctors, numerous tests, and Janet's periodic hospital stays. This process was expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. The hope followed by repeated disappointment was difficult to bear. Janet, typically calm and rational, often cried when she thought her husband couldn't hear her. But he noticed everything: her red eyes, swollen eyelids, and most painfully, her look of despair. Seth found it difficult to see his wife in this state. His primary desire was no longer for a child but for the happiness of the woman he loved. He didn't know how to help Janet, but as best as he could, Seth supported his wife. He arranged consultations at the best reproductive centers in the country, accompanied her to painful procedures, and comforted her. "Why don't we give up on this?" he sometimes suggested. "The race for a child has already acquired some unhealthy character. Let's develop our careers, it's important too." Before, work and scientific activity had been the main things in Janet's life. Her eyes lit up when she was told about the next development or experimental project. Work inspired Janet, gave her strength and energy, and she was very good at what she did. She was respected, invited to consultations, and was the person people turned to with difficult questions. Now, Janet had changed a lot. She no longer took on interesting projects, worked strictly from 9 to 5, and was eager to head home. Once an outstanding scientist, she now preferred simple routine work and completely abandoned her research. This really frightened Seth. Janet's changes made her tense. She became tearful, irritable, and somewhat precious. Most distressing was her fixation on inaccessible motherhood, making it her sole focus. Nothing else interested or pleased her, and she stopped communicating with her friends and colleagues. Janet spent her spare time studying information about her diagnosis. Years passed this way. Occasionally, Janet would calm down, return to work, but her dream of motherhood always resurfaced, leading to more doctor visits, tests, and research. Medicine is always advancing. New reproductive technologies appear, old ones improve. "We have to try it," she used to explain to her husband. Seth missed the old Janet, intelligent, driven, understanding. Sometimes she came back for a while, and those moments were blissful. They could discuss various topics, watch movies together, and plan trips. "We could adopt a child from the orphanage," Seth had suggested this to his wife multiple times. He believed that a child, even if not their own, would bring Janet joy and help her experience motherhood. However, Janet wanted only her own child and remained focused on this goal. Oblivious to everything else, 15 years into their marriage, the much-anticipated pregnancy finally happened, thanks to another experimental treatment. Both Seth and Janet were almost 40. Seth hadn't anticipated this outcome, and the news surprised and slightly scared him, disrupting his usual routine. After so many years of living just the two of them, this was a significant change. Despite the constant nausea during her first months of pregnancy, the recurring abdominal and lower back pain, and frequent dizziness, Janet was ecstatic. Her pregnancy was challenging and required her to spend most of her time in the hospital, constantly receiving intravenous drips, taking medications, and enduring painful injections. There were several threats of miscarriage, and Seth couldn't imagine what would happen to Janet if they lost the baby. Thankfully, the doctors managed to maintain the pregnancy due to Janet's strict monitoring. Truth be told, Seth didn't harbor any warm feelings for their future child. He literally viewed her or him as a problem, an obstacle preventing his wife from living a normal life. Susie was born, and Seth was the first to hold his tiny, wrinkled, red baby girl in his arms. Janet insisted he be present during the birth, saying, "This is a significant and long-awaited event. We've faced many challenges, and this is our reward. The doctors say we won't have more children." Seth was reluctant to be in the delivery room. He feared the birth process and didn't feel any reverence for it, but he felt he had to be there. When Seth first saw his newborn daughter's face, he felt his world turn upside down. It had changed entirely. The baby screamed, overwhelmed by the sudden changes. Seth perceived that his daughter was cold and in pain. An innate instinct told him this. He held her close, gently rocking her in his arms. The baby sobbed a few more times, looked at him, and calmed down. She felt safe with her father. Seth realized that his daughter was now the most important person to him, and he would move mountains for her. Then the baby was handed over to her mother. Susie needed to be fed, and Seth was asked to leave the room. "You'll see them later," the midwife said with a smile. "The mother and baby need some time alone for now." Seth and Janet were devoted parents, endlessly fascinated by their little Susie. They found joy in everything she did, reaching for toys, moving her limbs, and even her humming. Her first smile, tooth, and steps were all momentous events for them. While Seth worked each day, Janet stayed home with Susie, immersing herself in motherhood. She had long awaited this role and embraced it fully. She cared for Susie by massaging her, cooking nutritious meals, taking her for walks, and diligently studying child development literature to apply the knowledge to her own child. As a result, Susie developed skills faster than her peers. She began to speak, draw, sculpt, and fasten buttons earlier than expected. Seth and Janet were thrilled with their clever, beautiful daughter. Susie physically resembled Seth's grandmother with her thick, dark hair, large brown eyes, and dark skin, prompting blonde-haired, fair-skinned Janet to jokingly lament, "Nothing of me." Seth would retort good-naturedly, "No surprise, they say dark genes are stronger." Regardless, Janet couldn't help but admire how Susie's dark eyebrows and long dark eyelashes added to her charm. Eyelashes made her so striking that she wouldn't even need makeup. Susie was a gentle, obedient, and incredibly curious girl, a trait inherited from both parents. Her curiosity was a source of concern for Janet as Susie was always exploring. She was fascinated with everything, from items on the top closet shelves to the inner workings of an alarm clock to the depths of a puddle. She would climb trees to get a closer look at fruits or flowers and perch above puddles, peering intently into their darkness. Seth was proud of his daughter's inquisitive nature. Janet shared this sentiment, but she was often tired from constantly looking after her. Regardless, she never complained, finding joy in the challenges that came with raising their daughter. Seth sometimes felt that his wife was overly protective of their only child. He thought it would be beneficial to give the girl more independence. However, he didn't interfere with Janet's parenting methods. Firstly, she was well-read on child-rearing literature. Secondly, Janet had long desired motherhood, and now, finally becoming a mother, he felt it was best to let her take the lead in their child's upbringing. Susie adored her parents. She eagerly awaited her father's return from work, ready to bombard him with questions and engage in playful activities. Seth enjoyed taking walks with his daughter in the park after work, discussing various topics from insects to cartoons. Janet would sometimes join them, but often she preferred to stay at home, enjoying the peace and quiet while preparing a delicious dinner. Seth often took Susie to the playground where the little girl freely climbed on the slides and roundabouts, something she wouldn't do when her overly cautious mother was present. Susie quickly made friends with other children, and Seth was certain she would enjoy kindergarten. However, Janet resisted the idea. She had intentionally resigned from her job to take care of Susie herself. "I didn't have her just to leave her to other people's care," she said. "I want to fully enjoy motherhood. Besides, kindergarten is just a holding center for working parents. I have many activities planned for our girl to help her development. It's better for her to stay with me." Although Seth didn't dispute her, he occasionally mentioned the benefits of kindergarten, highlighting the presence of other children and activities like songs and dances. Janet was preparing her daughter for a career in science and believed that Susie must follow in her footsteps. Susie seemed to be able to excel in this direction, quickly grasping any information. However, Seth noticed other talents in her. Susie's voice was extraordinarily clear, resonant, and high-pitched. When she sang songs from cartoons, Seth would find himself listening intently. His experience in music school, though not particularly successful, equipped him with enough knowledge to recognize Susie's remarkable ear for music. "Maybe we should take her to a music teacher for an audition," Seth suggested to his wife. "Susie has talent." She's still a little girl," Janet dismissed. "Music schools accept older kids. Susie doesn't need that. She'll be a great scientist, you'll see." Becoming a mother had filled Janet with joy, but she had changed. She was overly anxious and focused too much on Susie. Nonetheless, it was an improvement from the time when she was trying to conceive. Seth still loved Janet, perhaps even more than when they were young. They had formed a family, and their wonderful child was growing up. Despite minor issues like Janet's excessive anxiety for their daughter, their life was filled with happiness. Seth often spoiled his daughter, Susie, with surprise gifts like sweets, dolls, and stuffed animals. Nothing made him happier than seeing her eyes light up with joy at the sight of a new gift. Hearing her say "Thank you, Daddy" melted his heart. He had never imagined he could feel such intense emotions for anything. Janet always ensured that Susie's birthdays were memorable, planning elaborate celebrations with themed decorations and gifts. For Susie's second birthday, the theme was Disney princesses. Her third birthday was an underwater king's palace party inspired by her fascination with the Little Mermaid, and the fourth was unicorn-themed, reflecting her love for these mythical creatures. In just an hour, Janet could transform their apartment into a magical haven for Susie's favorite characters. "I wish I could ride one," Susie said dreamily. Janet only smiled and waved her hands, saying, "Daughter, you understand unicorns live far away, they don't wander into our places." Susie sighed, I understand, and it's very, very unfortunate." Seth decided to fulfill his daughter's birthday wish by any means necessary. He visited the racetrack and spoke with instructors who handled ponies. He had a fantastic idea and attempted to bring it to life. One of the instructors enthusiastically embraced Seth's plan, and together they devised a masquerade costume for a beautiful white pony to impersonate a unicorn. A twisted plastic horn on Velcro, pink ribbons for the mane and tail, aqua paint to draw hearts on the animal's sides, and a wreath of artificial flowers were all part of the transformation into a fairy tale character. Seth anticipated his daughter's joyous reaction. It was expensive, but he was willing to spend for his beloved little princess. With the main surprise prepared, Seth ordered a plush unicorn as a gift. The loving father didn't stop there. Susie was 4 years old, and it was time to give her something beautiful and elegant, something distinctly feminine. He wanted her to get used to it from a young age, so Seth commissioned a jewelry workshop to create a wonderful set of a silver bracelet and earrings. The unique detail was that the jewelry was crafted into tiny unicorns. Finding a craftsman willing to undertake such a complex task took a long time. Many professionals were reluctant to get involved. Eventually, an elderly jeweler agreed to the project. It was a lengthy process filled with constant improvements and refinements. However, the final product was so beautiful that Seth couldn't help but admire it in awe. Janet was equally thrilled. "My God, what a miracle this is," she exclaimed. "I've never seen anything like it." "And there's nothing else like it in the world," Seth proudly replied, relishing his wife's reaction. "This is exclusive, especially for Susie. Look, there on the bracelet, her name is engraved in calligraphic script." "How sweet and exquisite it all is," Janet concluded. "The gift for a real lady." Susie's 4th birthday party was a resounding success. She woke to an apartment adorned with balloons, vibrant pictures, and unicorn-themed decorations. Gifts from her parents were piled high on a chair next to her crib. Among the toys, fancy dresses, and colorful books, the unicorn jewelry stood out. Susie immediately asked to wear the bracelet and had not taken it off since. Seth watched his joyful daughter with a smile. In the evening, guests arrived, and the apartment instantly buzzed with noise and laughter. Grandparents, friends of Janet and Seth, and children Susie's age all gathered. Susie, the birthday girl, was showered with gifts and compliments. However, she also wanted to surprise her guests. Dressed as a princess, Susie stood on her chair and sang a song from her favorite unicorn cartoon for everyone. Seth listened to his daughter's pure, ringing voice. His heart swelled with tenderness and joy as he marveled at his beautiful, talented daughter. Fate had bestowed upon Seth and Janet a beautiful gift, and he vowed once again to do everything in his power to ensure Susie's happiness. The guests applauded loudly, calling Susie back for an encore, which she happily obliged, enjoying the attention and compliments. Uninhibited, brave, and charismatic, Susie was a born performer. Despite his wife's plans, Seth knew their daughter was destined for the stage, believing Janet would eventually understand. The evening's main surprise was yet to come. Both children and adults rushed outside, gathering on the porch, where a real unicorn emerged from the archway, much to everyone's delight. Susie squealed with joy, an example quickly followed by the other children. A young fairy, played by an enthusiastic girl instructor, accompanied the unicorn, wearing a light floral sundress with her blonde curls falling over her shoulders. May I? May I go to him? Susie asked the fairy, overcome with joy that her biggest dream had come true. Of course you can. He'll be happy to give you a ride, the fairy assured her. Susie enjoyed a couple of full rounds around the yard on the unicorn. After dismounting, she stroked its face and asked if her guests could also ride it. Of course, he's here to make your party perfect, the fairy replied. The young guests took turns riding the unicorn pony around the yard, joy lighting up their eyes. Susie's party was unforgettable for them as well. Seth looked at his daughter, seeing her as not only intelligent and beautiful but also kind and considerate. At the age of 4, she showed care for others by asking the fairy to give her guests a unicorn ride. What a thoughtful idea for a 4-year-old, he thought. It was a memorable day filled with vibrant impressions and equally vivid photos. One photo captured Susie hugging a new plush unicorn, a silver bracelet shining on her wrist, and a tiara crowning her head. She smiled broadly into the camera, radiating pure happiness. This was the photo Janet would hand over to investigators just 3 months later. One warm and sunny September evening during the beautiful Indian summer, golden trees bathed in gentle sunlight and leaves rustling underfoot, Janet and Susie decided to enjoy the wonderful weather with a walk in the park, coinciding with the city's celebrations. Janet suggested a family walk in the park, but Seth declined due to work he had brought home from the factory. An important inspection was imminent, and some reports needed to be urgently completed. Regrettably, I won't be able to join my 2 beautiful ladies, Seth said, shaking his head, though I would really like to. But Daddy, Susie protested, pouting. Dressed in a light red dress and a matching beret, she looked charming. The beret was stylishly tilted to the side, and her shoulders were adorned with 2 tight braids tied with pink silk ribbons. Her new patent shoes added to her look. It wasn't a particularly modern style, but it was original and delightful. Janet enjoyed dressing her daughter up like a doll, always on the lookout for stylish, unique pieces. Susie usually stood out among other children. Baby, I need to work, Seth waved his hands, but don't worry. This weekend, I promise we'll go to the ponds. To the ponds. Susie rejoiced. That's great. We'll ride the Ferris wheel and feed the ducks buns, right? Yes, Seth smiled, and then we'll go to the cafe to eat your favorite pancakes with berries. Deal? Deal. And now have fun without me, but you'll tell me everything before bedtime and listen to your mom, okay? A-okay, Susie nodded, beaming. Susie hugged her father, her red coat sleeves pulled up slightly, revealing her wrists. A silver bracelet with unicorns sparkled on one of them. The girl never took off her favorite jewelry. One of her earrings had already been lost due to an unreliable clasp. The second, now practically useless, lay in a box in Susie's desk. "Okay, we're off," Janet, her mother, smiled at her husband. Seth hugged his wife, kissed his daughter, walked them to the elevator, and waved at the closing door. The image of an all-dressed-up, happy Susie smiling at her father was still in his mind. Seth had no inkling that he would never see his daughter again. Seth returned to his apartment and sat at his computer, immersing himself in his work. He wanted to make the most of the quiet time before his daughter returned in a few hours. He knew she would want to share her experiences, and he would need to put his work aside to listen attentively. This parental engagement, Seth knew, was important for children. However, about an hour later, he heard the turning of the lock. It was too early. Janet rushed into the living room, and Seth immediately noticed her disheveled hair, unnatural paleness, trembling lips, and the panic in her eyes. "Susie didn't come back?" Janet asked, looking hopefully at her husband. Seth shook his head, his heart filled with terror. "But she was with you, wasn't she? What happened?" Seth asked, confused. Instead of responding, Janet dialed the police number in a rush. Seth found the details of the incident much later. First, Janet frantically searched the park for her daughter, interacted with the police, and attempted to calm herself down. Despite her hysteria, she managed to answer all the police's questions thoroughly. The search for the lost girl in the park began immediately. Police squads scoured the area, joined by volunteers. The trouble that piled on the 2 unhappy parents left no one indifferent. The police persuaded Janet and Seth to stay at home, arguing that the girl might return on her own. "We need someone home when she does. You won't be of help with the search," the policeman in uniform persuaded them. "It's unnecessary stress. We need to work calmly without distractions. You understand?" Seth sat on the couch, holding his trembling wife tightly. Janet blamed herself relentlessly, using the harshest words. Initially, Seth wanted to blame Janet too. She wasn't vigilant enough, she lost sight of their child. However, upon seeing her state, he held back. There was no point in blaming someone already overwhelmed with grief. This could have happened to anyone, it was just an unfortunate accident. It wasn't Janet's fault. "And we had such a good walk along the alleys," the woman sobbed as she shared her memories. Susie was delighted with everything happening in the park. She loved the animators, photographers with monkeys, music, the smell of cotton candy and popcorn, and the children's master classes. The park was crowded that day, which was expected since it was City Day. Festive events always drew people from all over the city. The celebration's epicenter was the summer stage in the park's center, where a festive concert showcased the region's best children's groups. The little artists sang, danced, played musical instruments, and acted out scenes from famous works. The hosts held contests for the young spectators between performances and awarded the winners with prizes. Susie was drawn to the stage. "I didn't want to go there with her," Janet told her husband. "The crowd was massive and she's just a little girl. Why did we need to push through?" But she wanted to see the concert so badly. "She begged me, pleaded with me, even tried to bribe me." As always, she was determined. Seth nodded, understanding exactly what Susie's ambitions were. She dreamed of performing on stage one day, as she was innately an artist. "And we finally found a spot where she could see the stage," Janet continued. She was so excited. The performances captivated her, and she was bouncing with joy. "I turned away for just a moment to grab us some ice cream. When I turned back, she was gone. I called her name, looked everywhere, asked people around, but she just vanished." The feeling of dread washed over Seth. He squeezed Janet's hand, trying to comfort her. "We'll find her," he whispered, though he felt as if the ground had fallen from beneath his feet. The search was on, but all they could do was wait and hope. These episodes, he understood that Janet needed to release her pent-up emotions. He was also dealing with his own grief and sense of helplessness, often retreating into silence and work to cope. In the weeks following Susie's disappearance, their apartment became a hub of activity. Friends, family, and neighbors dropped by to offer support and help with the search. The police continued their investigation, following up on every lead and tip that came their way. The media covered the story extensively, keeping Susie's face and story in the public eye. One day, Seth and Janet received a visit from Detective Harris, who had been handling Susie's case. He sat with them in their living room, looking at them with a mixture of empathy and determination. "We haven't given up," he assured them. "There are still avenues we're exploring. We've received a few promising leads recently, and we're following up on them." Seth nodded, clinging to any sliver of hope. Janet, though exhausted and frail, managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Detective. Please find our daughter." The days dragged on, blending into an endless stream of worry and waiting. Seth tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy by going to work, but his thoughts were always on Susie. He often found himself staring blankly at his computer screen, unable to focus on the tasks at hand. Janet's condition continued to deteriorate. She was barely eating or sleeping, consumed by guilt and despair. Her mother and mother-in-law took turns staying with her, trying to provide comfort and support. They encouraged her to take care of herself, reminding her that Susie would need her to be strong when she returned. One evening, as Seth was about to leave work, his phone rang. It was Detective Harris. "Seth, we need you to come down to the station. We've got something." Seth's heart raced. "What is it? Did you find her?" "We can't discuss it over the phone. Please, come to the station as soon as you can." Seth hurried home, where Janet was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television. Janet, we need to go to the police station. They have news." Janet's eyes widened, and she nodded silently, grabbing her coat. The drive to the station was tense, filled with a mix of hope and dread. When they arrived, Detective Harris met them and led them to a private room. He took a deep breath before speaking. "We received a call from a woman who saw Susie's picture on the news. She believes she saw a child matching Susie's description in a nearby town. The child was with a man who didn't seem like her father." Janet gasped, clutching Seth's hand. "Where? Is she okay?" "We're not sure yet, but we're following up on the lead. I wanted you to know that we're taking this very seriously. We've sent officers to the location, and they're investigating as we speak." The wait for further news was agonizing. Hours felt like days as Seth and Janet sat in the station, their hearts heavy with anticipation. Finally, Detective Harris returned, his expression a mix of relief and caution. "We found the man and the child. The child matches Susie's description, but we need you to come with us to confirm." They were driven to a nearby town where they were led to a small house. Inside, a little girl with dark hair and brown eyes was sitting on a couch, looking scared and confused. When she saw Seth and Janet, her eyes lit up and she ran towards them. "The mommy! Daddy!" she cried, tears streaming down her face. Janet scooped her up, holding her tightly as she sobbed with relief. Seth embraced them both, his own tears flowing freely. They had found their Susie. The man who had taken her was arrested, and Susie was taken to the hospital for a thorough checkup. She had a few scrapes and bruises but was otherwise unharmed. The doctors assured Seth and Janet that she would be okay physically, though she might need time and support to recover emotionally. Back at home, life slowly began to return to normal. Janet and Seth were more protective of Susie than ever, and they made sure to spend as much time with her as possible. They enrolled her in counseling to help her process the trauma she had experienced, and they worked together to rebuild their lives. The ordeal had changed them all, but it had also brought them closer. They had faced their worst nightmare and come out the other side. As they sat together one evening, watching Susie play with her toys, Seth took Janet's hand and squeezed it. "We're going to be okay," he said softly. "We have each other and we have Susie. That's all that matters." Janet nodded, tears in her eyes. "Yes, we will. We're a family, and nothing will ever change that." It confronted with the harsh reality that the case of Susie's disappearance might remain unsolved indefinitely. The authorities had done all they could, but the trail had gone cold, and no new leads had emerged. Seth tried to keep his spirits up, finding solace in his work and the routine of daily life, but Janet's condition continued to deteriorate. Despite her fragile health, Janet never gave up hope. She continued to search for answers, poring over every piece of information she could find about missing children. Her determination was both heartbreaking and inspiring. She maintained a small shrine in Susie's room, filled with photographs, toys, and the memories of their lost daughter. It became a place of solace for her, a way to feel connected to Susie despite the long years of separation. One day, as Seth was preparing breakfast, he heard the familiar sound of Janet's footsteps shuffling down the hallway. She entered the kitchen, looking as frail as ever, but with a new light in her eyes. "Seth," she said quietly, I had another dream about Susie last night." Seth turned to her, his heart aching with both hope and sorrow. "What was it about, Janet?" "She was older, maybe a teenager. She looked so much like you." She was happy, smiling. I think she's still out there somewhere." Seth embraced his wife, holding her gently. I hope so too, Janet. I really do." Life continued its relentless march forward, and the seasons changed as they always did. Janet's health fluctuated, but she remained determined to keep Susie's memory alive. She participated in support groups for parents of missing children, finding some comfort in the shared experiences of others who understood her pain. Seth, too, found a measure of peace in these meetings, though he rarely spoke. Listening to others helped him process his own grief. One spring morning, 13 years after Susie's disappearance, the phone rang. Seth answered, expecting another telemarketer or a concerned friend checking in. Instead, it was Detective Harris. "Seth, we might have a breakthrough in Susie's case. Can you and Janet come to the station?" Seth felt a rush of conflicting emotions. After so many years of silence, any news was both a beacon of hope and a source of dread. He called Janet, who hurried to get dressed, her frailty momentarily forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. At the police station, Detective Harris greeted them with a serious expression. "We received a tip from a woman who recently saw a news report about Susie's case. She claims to have seen a young woman matching Susie's description in a small town about 50 miles from here. The young woman seemed out of place, and the tipster got a feeling that something was off." Janet's eyes filled with tears. "Do you think it could really be her?" We don't know yet, but we have to investigate. We wanted to let you know before we proceed. We're going to follow up on this lead right away." The wait was agonizing. Every second felt like an eternity as Seth and Janet clung to each other for support. Hours passed before Detective Harris returned, his expression unreadable. "We found the young woman," he said. "She has no identification and seems confused about her past. We're bringing her in for questioning and a DNA test to confirm her identity." Janet's heart pounded in her chest. "Can we see her?" "Not yet. We need to go through the proper procedures first. But if the DNA test confirms she's Susie, you'll be the first to know." Days passed in a blur of anxiety and cautious hope. Finally, the call came. Detective Harris's voice was calm but carried a note of excitement. "The DNA test is a match. The young woman we found is Susie." Seth and Janet's world turned upside down. They rushed to the hospital where Susie was being kept for observation. When they saw her, it was like seeing a ghost brought back to life. Susie was older, thinner, and clearly traumatized, but she was alive. Janet rushed to her daughter's side, tears streaming down her face. "Susie, my baby, it's really you." Susie looked at her parents, her eyes filled with confusion and recognition. "Mom? Dad?" Seth joined them, his voice breaking with emotion. Yes, Susie. We're here. We're never going to let you go again." The reunion was bittersweet. Susie had been through unimaginable hardships and would need time to heal and adjust. But for the first time in 13 years there was hope. The family was together again, ready to face the future, whatever it might hold, with renewed strength and love. The station received calls to identify children resembling Susie. Alerts for the missing girl were sent nationwide, with occasional calls coming from concerned citizens claiming to have seen a girl who looked like Susie near stores, playgrounds, or ponds. Seth and Janet examined photos and surveillance footage. Sometimes, they were shown homeless girls found at train stations, but Susie was never among them. Take a closer look," urged the investigator. "Perhaps it's her. A lot of time has passed, she would have grown and changed." But both parents shook their heads. They were certain they would recognize their daughter, even if she had grown up. The investigators' calls only exacerbated Janet's condition. Each call brought desperate hope followed by bitter disappointment, reigniting the pain she had felt years ago. Hysterical breakdowns and self-blame often followed. It took considerable effort for Seth to console his wife. Seth's acquaintances urged him to leave Janet, saying, "She herself is not living. She's preventing you from returning to normal life. You've accepted that Susie isn't coming back. You have a chance to remarry, perhaps become a father again." However, Seth couldn't imagine such a scenario. He still loved Janet, his wife, the closest person to him. Their shared tribulations had bonded them. While he no longer hoped for Susie's return, he still believed Janet would recover from her immense grief and become herself again. He hoped they might travel again, believing a change of scenery would be beneficial. But things didn't work out. Another heart attack took Janet's life. She died in his arms. The ambulance didn't arrive in time. He grieved deeply, feeling immense sorrow for Janet's shattered life. He reviewed their life since their daughter's disappearance, wondering if there was anything more he could have done for his wife to pull her out of that state. It seemed he couldn't. A few years later, Jasmine entered Seth's life. Approaching 60, he never imagined such a change in his destiny. Jasmine, a colleague, was a divorced woman who had single-handedly raised 2 sons, now living apart. Accustomed to caring for others, Jasmine struggled with loneliness and feeling unneeded. Gradually, she and Seth grew closer. He found comfort and contentment with this warm, caring woman, rediscovering the joy of having someone who cared for and tried to please him. He also enjoyed feeling like a guardian and protector once more. Soon, they were living together in Seth's apartment. He had long ago renovated all the rooms to erase reminders of his past family life. It was too painful to see the curtains chosen by Janet or the children's furniture brought specifically for Susie, knowing his daughter and beloved wife were gone forever. Jasmine was well acquainted with Seth's life story. She supported him with comfort in the form of hugs and gentle caresses, without pressuring him with unnecessary questions. In return, Seth listened attentively to Jasmine's life stories. Jasmine had faced different hardships. Her husband was an abusive alcoholic, and escaping him was challenging. Raising two sons single-handedly presented its own trials, but these tribulations didn't break Jasmine, they only made her stronger. While fate had dealt Seth a much harsher blow, he bore his sorrow. Thoughts of Susie still haunted him intermittently. Anything could trigger memories of his daughter, like the curious little girl bombarding her parents with questions as they passed by Seth on their family walk. He glanced at the inquisitive child, smiling briefly, before turning away towards a fountain where a small crowd had gathered in the square. Initially unclear about their interest, Seth soon heard a clear, high voice singing a familiar melody from a cartoon about unicorns, Susie's favorite. The young singer's voice bore a striking resemblance to Susie's, and tears welled up in Seth's eyes as longing gripped him once more. Unable to ignore the singing, Seth weaved through the crowd and was astonished by what he saw, a girl about Susie's age when she disappeared, standing by the fountain. Though she had Romany features, dark skin, long loose hair, black eyebrows, and enormous brown eyes, she bore a faint resemblance to Susie. She wore a long-sleeved blouse, a floor-length skirt with ruffles, and a bulky necklace too large for her petite frame. The little girl diligently played the familiar tune, and Seth noticed one of her bracelets, a unicorn-themed piece that looked exclusive, possibly belonging to his daughter. Seth needed a closer look to be certain, but he had a strong hunch. After finishing her song and receiving applause from the crowd, the girl was approached by a curly-haired teenager who seemed caring and protective. He smiled at her, asked something, and led her away with the money box. Seth hesitated by the lamppost, unsure of what to do next. He didn't want to scare the little girl by approaching her directly. Instead, he decided to wait, convinced that an adult would soon come for her. Sure enough, a few minutes later, the teenager returned, and Seth trailed them cautiously. Uncertain about his next move, should he approach the boy and ask about the bracelet directly? Seth kept his distance as they navigated through narrow streets and eventually reached the city's outskirts. Beyond the streets lay a vacant lot and a bypass road, where Seth spotted camp wagons and people gathered around fires, a scene that suggested a community. Seth contemplated his next steps. Would he be welcomed if he approached the adults here? Despite his apprehension, he felt compelled to continue his investigation. For the first time in years, he sensed a potential lead on Susie. Could this be the breakthrough he needed to find his daughter and uncover the truth about what happened to her? With determination, Seth continued to follow the children. Suddenly aware of him, the boy looked back warily and quickened his pace, the little girl struggling to keep up as they ran through the grass. Suddenly, from the last house on the street, a young Romany woman appeared. It was evident she was the mother of the little singer. The girl swiftly withdrew her hand from the boy's grasp and ran to her, embracing her tightly. The beautiful Romany woman showered the child's face with kisses, whispering affectionate words into her ear. The little singer laughed joyfully while Seth remained frozen in place. The young Romany girl, her hair, eyes, eyebrows, lips, bore a striking resemblance to Seth's grandmother, who Susie also greatly resembled. The realization hit Seth like a cold splash of water. No, it can't be. The woman's tan face, white-toothed smile, large gold earrings, and a distinctive mole on her cheek, shaped like a small heart, were oddly familiar to Seth. Susie had always been pleased that she had the same mark on her cheek as the unicorn from the cartoon. The woman noticed Seth's intense gaze and her smile slowly faded. She held the child closer and was about to leave when Seth called out, "Susie! Susie!" The gypsy woman paused, scrutinizing the unfamiliar mature man before her, clutching her daughter. She resolutely approached him. Excuse me," Seth began. "Don't be scared. I won't harm you. I just need you to do something." The latter phrase slipped out unexpectedly. After all, it's known that gypsy women tell fortunes for a living." The woman grinned, and the little girl in her arms mirrored her smile. "All right, I'll tell your fortune. Esmeralda, go back to the camp and wait for me there," she instructed the child. Esmeralda nodded obediently and scurried off towards the gypsy camp, following the boy who was already near the vacant lot. "Is her name Esmeralda?" Seth asked, smiling at the gypsy woman. The more he observed her, the more he became convinced that she was the grown-up Susie. The man realized he might be letting his imagination run wild, but there were too many coincidences: the song from his daughter's favorite cartoon sung by little Esmeralda, the bracelet on the girl's hand, and the young gypsy woman's appearance. "Yes, my daughter's name is Esmeralda," the woman finally responded. "What do you want me to predict?" "Many years ago, my daughter was kidnapped while out for a walk with her mother. They got caught in a crowd and she was lost in the crush? She was never found. I want to know what happened to her." "I'm willing to pay whatever the cost," Seth said urgently. "A kidnapped daughter." The gypsy woman's voice trembled. "That's frightening. I can't predict such a thing. May I ask where your little girl got that bracelet?" "My daughter had the same one," Seth asked, afraid the woman might leave after his question. I also have a question." "Why did you call me Susie?" she countered. "That was my daughter's name, and I thought that I was her," she interrupted herself. "Yes," Seth admitted, chuckling at the unexpected turn in their conversation. "My name is Penelope. That's what the gypsies call me. But on the back of this bracelet, which I've never parted with, it says Susie. I came up to you because you called me by that name. It's strange and interesting. I can't believe it. Apparently you really might be my daughter. Tell me about yourself, please. Who are your parents? How long have you been in the gypsy camp? Were you born there?" Penelope shook her head. "No, ima funling. My father found me ragged and hungry at the train station. I don't remember much myself, I was so young. But this bracelet, it's been with me as long as I can remember. They told me my grandmother gave it to me. Now I realize it's from another life." "I always knew it," Seth said, shaking his head. "It's unique, there can be no mistake. It belonged to Susie. I believe that's you. Tell me more about yourself." Penelope sighed. "From the moment I arrived in this town with my family, everything felt familiar: the cityscapes, the smells, the situations. Now our meeting. I want to understand it all too." Little Penelope always knew that her father, Sylvanus, had picked her up at the train station. "Your family abandoned you. White people often do that to get rid of unwanted children. We Roma have a different attitude towards children," Penelope continued. The Sylvanus family, already having 4 sons, welcomed a little girl into their home. She was treated with care and tenderness by her mother, Camille, grandmother, Ray, and her brothers. The little girl, who had a gift for singing and dancing, quickly became a beloved and valued member of the family. Her talents also presented a potential source of income for the family. She particularly enjoyed performing with her brothers, dancing and singing around the fire to the approval and applause of their community. Like the rest of their community, the family lived in a van, traveling across the country and stopping in various towns. The scenery, the people, and the homes all changed as they moved. Penelope experienced both large metropolitan cities and smaller urban settlements, meeting new people and performing in public squares. This was how the gypsies earned their living. Upon arriving at a new settlement, the children would sing and dance, the women would tell fortunes, and the men would engage in their own secretive, serious business only. When she grew older, Penelope understood what this business entailed: stealing. This was the reason they never stayed in one place for too long, to avoid persecution, retaliation, and the police. Penelope liked her way of life. She loved her strict father, Sylvanus, her affectionate and talkative mother, Lavinia, and her caring yet different brothers. She had a particularly close relationship with her grandmother, Ray, Sylvanus's mother. The old woman doted on Penelope, telling her stories, giving her jewelry, and performing rituals to keep her happy and healthy. She often reminded Penelope how lucky she was because Sylvanus had found her alone and abandoned at a train station. "They frequently spoke ill of my biological parents," Penelope said, studying Seth's face for familiar features. "They claimed that white people were irresponsible towards their children. But I saw a different picture on city streets. Yes, there were street children, but I also saw many affluent families with happy and secure children. Finally, I deduced that it was my biological parents who were at fault. Because why else would a child be left at a train station? She looked at Seth defiantly, implying her accusation. If he truly was her father, then he was responsible for leaving a little girl alone at a train station, hungry and in rags, Penelope stated, staring at Seth. Didn't you watch your daughter? Or did you decide to abandon her? What are you saying? Seth retorted. Our little girl was our most precious treasure. He began to reminisce about the blissful 4 years he and Janet had spent with their beautiful daughter. He described the struggle they faced to have a child, then narrated Susie's early years, recalling warm, joyful moments. It happened. I remember very little, he said, recalling Susie's first skills, their shared travels, walks, and splendid holidays that Janet had planned for her daughter. Our girl loved unicorns and sang beautifully, just like your daughter, Esmeralda. How did she know the song she sang at the fountain? That's Susie's favorite song, she used to sing it in a very similar way, Seth remarked. Penelope didn't respond immediately, she seemed to be trying to remember something. I taught it to her, the woman finally said. Something from my past life lingered, not just the bracelet. I remembered that song. I could read at the age of 4, surprisingly, and I've retained that ability. We don't teach girls to read, only boys, and even then, only superficially. But I can read. Sometimes I dreamed about people who loved me deeply. I don't remember their faces, but I remembered their hands warm and caring. I thought it was my imagination. Also, just now when you were telling the story, I recalled something. Yes, I really rode a unicorn, a real one. I dreamt of this scene several times, and the unicorn was exactly as you just described it. So, are we really father and daughter? Penelope asked. We can only confirm that after a DNA analysis, Seth replied, his voice trembling. But it appears to be true. Penelope pressed her fingers to her temples, wrinkling her nose just like her mother used to do when she was worried. So what do we do now? The young woman looked at the mature man, her face filled with confusion, seeking reassurance. I think we need to verify everything to be sure, but I no longer doubt that you are Susie. There are too many coincidences, Seth said thoughtfully. I think you should go back to your real home. Or do you want to keep living in the gypsy camp? Didn't you mention that you were happy with the gypsies? That's how it was when I was a kid, Penelope said, shaking her head. But when I grew up, everything changed. Children in the camp are treated very differently. But life for adults is not sweet at all. There are many chores, and women must obey men unquestionably. A husband can even beat his wife for disobedience, and he faces no consequences. I can't do what I want, read, walk, study, and I have to deceive people for money. That's the most unpleasant thing. If I don't bring money home in the evening, I'll be punished, and I've been punished more than once. Penelope then recounted how Sylvanus married her off when she was about 16 years old. Her family had chosen a suitable groom for their only daughter, Damien, the son of a well-off gypsy. Damien, however, remained indifferent to both his wife and daughter, focusing on his own interests, a situation widely accepted in their community. Penelope didn't mind and felt no jealousy, her attention was completely absorbed by her daughter. As she sang songs to her, crafted beautiful clothes for her, and braided her hair. Esmeralda inherited her mother's talent for singing and dancing, Penelope continued. The people of the camp decided to utilize this gift. As Esmeralda grew older, she became a street performer, captivating audiences in various city squares with her singing and enjoying the generous applause and compensation she received. Despite her daughter's joy in performing, Penelope harbored deep concerns about Esmeralda's future. She feared that her daughter would follow the same path she had, without receiving an education or pursuing a professional career, destined to continue entertaining people with her voice. Penelope worried that as Esmeralda matured and lost her youthful charm and spontaneity, she might be pushed into fortune-telling. I believe they kidnapped you in the crowd, Seth said, looking at his daughter with conviction. Now fully convinced, he regretted the lost years Esmeralda had spent among strangers, adhering to unfamiliar traditions and strict rules. But everything will change now. It's possible, Penelope nodded. In my time, it didn't happen, but grandmother Rini told me that in the past, childless gypsy couples would pick up children from city streets, choosing young ones who wouldn't remember their past and raising them as their own. They saw dark-haired babies to avoid suspicion. A blonde child among dark-haired gypsies would stand out. And you look just like my grandmother. Seth smiled. I'll show you the pictures later. The resemblance is uncanny. That fact probably worked against us too, Penelope sighed. The gypsies chose you because you resembled them somewhat. I still can't believe it. Penelope looked utterly lost, glancing between the tower and Seth. So, you're going to take the child, claim her as your own, and never return? It's not that simple. They won't let me leave, Penelope explained urgently. I'll go with you just in case. What do you mean they won't let you leave? I'll call the police, they'll be arrested for kidnapping. No, we have to handle this differently. You don't know these people, Seth cautioned. We need to act secretly. Afterwards, we'll have to leave because they'll be searching for me. Betrayal is severely punished here. You'll be in danger too. Consider it carefully. Do you really want all this? Do you want to disrupt your peaceful life? It's a big decision, Penelope admitted. Of course, I'm ready, Seth responded immediately. All right then, let's do it this way. Tomorrow I'll go with Esmeralda to the square as usual. We're monitored during the day, they check in the morning, around noon, and again in the evening. At 11 o'clock, come get us. We won't be followed at that time. We'll have to hide, lie low for a while, maybe a week, maybe a month. They'll be searching for me. Hide in my apartment, no one will search for you there. Do you live alone? Penelope asked. No, but I'm not alone, Seth replied, a pang of sorrow piercing his heart as he thought of Janet, who had passed without knowing what happened to Susie. Tomorrow at 11, I'll come for you, okay? Penelope said, turning quickly and hurrying back to the gypsy camp, where she seemed to be expected. For the rest of the day and night, Seth remained in an odd state, filled with alternating feelings of joy and doubt. Standing next to the girl, he had no doubt she was his daughter. But now, as she was far away, uncertainty crept in. Jasmine, who always listened attentively to Seth, was also filled with excitement, almost to the point of tears. Unlike Seth, she was certain that everything would turn out fine. This woman is definitely Susie. Such coincidences are impossible. I can't wait to meet her and her daughter, Jasmine affirmed. That night Seth couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, consumed by thoughts that Susie and Esmeralda might not show up at the fountain by the agreed time the next day. He wondered if Susie might change her mind or if there was some ulterior motive. Perhaps she enjoyed playing tricks on others. The following day, both Jasmine and Seth took time off work. Seth arrived at the fountain earlier than the agreed time. Little Esmeralda, just like the previous day, delighted the crowd with her clear, ringing voice. Susie initially remained out of sight, but Seth eventually spotted her. She sat at a distance, watching her daughter intently. When their eyes met, Susie gestured for Seth to take his time. He nodded in understanding and continued to observe, not wanting to miss any important moment. Finally, Susie stood up from the bench, walked over to Esmeralda, took the little girl into her arms, and then hurried over to Seth. From there, they all strolled through the narrow streets until they reached the parking lot where Seth had left his car. Penelope constantly glanced over her shoulder, worried that they were being followed, but there was no one behind them. Jasmine warmly welcomed the two runaways, providing them with comfortable clothes and a homemade meal. She loved caring for others, and now she had two individuals in need of affection and comfort. Penelope glanced around as if trying to recall the past. I've renovated the apartment. It's completely transformed since you lived here, Seth explained. But you know, the view from the window seems familiar, Penelope responded thoughtfully. Something's missing though. I think there used to be a tall tree here. Its branches would scratch against the glass. I really used to enjoy that. It was cut down, Seth replied, surprised by Susie's detailed memory. It blocked the light, so it was removed. That's a shame, Penelope sighed. Later, Seth and Esmeralda strolled along the seashore, their bare feet imprinting the wet sand. Esmeralda was full of questions, much like her mother had been. She was a quick and clever girl, already displaying an aptitude for learning. Seth was certain she would excel in school, as she could already read, write, and count with ease. Currently, Seth accompanied Esmeralda to her 4th music lesson. She was thrilled with the music school, and he hoped her enthusiasm would endure. If not, they were prepared to explore other interests for Esmeralda. The man could hardly believe how much his life had changed in just a year. Previously, Penelope and Esmeralda had hidden in the apartment for about a month. The gypsy camp had long departed, but there were still sightings of gypsies prowling the city. Once, a young man even approached them. Seth and his family had found peace and contentment in their new seaside town. Jasmine had secured a job at the local library and enjoyed spending time with her son's children, who had become good friends with Esmeralda. Meanwhile, Susie was gradually adapting to her new life, participating in a hairdressing course and performing at a local restaurant, where her singing delighted the audience. Despite the tranquility, Susie still carried some apprehensions about her past and the possibility of being found by the roar, presumably referring to the Romani community. Seth and Jasmine provided unwavering support, helping her navigate through any fears or uncertainties that surfaced. One sunny day, Seth suggested they go for a swim at the beach, prompting Esmeralda to remind him that she had to attend her music class. They agreed to go swimming later and then visit the pond in the city to feed the ducks, a reminder of the simple pleasures of life that brought back memories of Susie as a child. As they prepared to leave, Esmeralda noticed Seth's thoughtful expression and asked what he was thinking about, noting his sad face. Seth reassured her it was more pensive than sad, as he pondered whether they should go for pizza or ice cream after her class. Esmeralda, ever perceptive, smiled and remarked on how she had inherited his thoughtful expression. In that moment, Seth realized how fortunate he was to have his daughter and granddaughter by his side, bringing joy and warmth into his life. All worries seemed to vanish in the presence of Esmeralda's youthful enthusiasm and Susie's resilience. Together, they embraced the simple joys of family and the peaceful life they had built by the sea.